So welcome everyone. This is Roy Morgan's 5th year measuring brand trust and brand distrust. Thank you for attending. And a special thanks to the people behind these numbers that I'm about to present. So David Laffin, who runs our Risk Lab and who runs all of our customer experience practice at Roy Morgan. That's part of our research institute. And thank you to Adam Ray, who ran the data for this presentation. And Julian McCrann for his political and economic wisdom and his knowledge and analysis of all things political and economic. Julian runs the Morgan Poll, if you don't know. And finally, to Dr. Ross Honeywell, our social scientist, who brings deep experience of the human condition, what drives us and how this plays out in social, political, economic and commercial terms. So today we'll be revealing the ranking for brands for the year to December 21. But first, as promised, new research on trust and distrust in the government and the most trusted and most distrusted political leaders in Australia. Now this is obviously critically important before an election, and particularly an election in the middle of a global pandemic, on the brink of perhaps the Third World War, and definitely global political unrest. The data will reveal that the government, in all its guises, is deeply distrusted. As context for the whole thing, if an election were held today, the LNP government would not be returned. So we see the ALP is now sitting on 58% compared to 42% on a two-party preferred basis. And that's a swing of 9.5 or 9.5% since the last election. That's huge. And the government confidence rating at 83 points. Basically, that means that more Australians believe that the country's going in the wrong direction than in the right direction. So if we look then more broadly at Australia today, despite some quite good economic and financial news, like GDP growth, like the share market being at a really high level, like really booming retail sales, big amounts of spending. There's some really good things and solid savings and low interest rates. Petrol prices have now hit a record high. And what we're seeing is consumer confidence at a pretty low level. Consumer confidence today is at 91.2. That's down about 4 points in a week, and it's down about 17 points since the beginning of the year. So that's the context that we find ourselves in. And with that level of confidence below 100, and 100 means people are equally optimistic and pessimistic, with that degree of consumer confidence, it would be really hard to see how any government would be re-elected. But why do we say that the election will not be won on trust, but will be lost on distrust? Everyone gets trust. We're all hearing about trust. Everyone talking about the election and about politics talks about trust, particularly around election time. And trust is indeed the foundation of all human connections, from intimate relationships to everyday business transactions. But it's distrust where our deepest fears, pain, and betrayal surface. It's the shock of discovering we were foolish to trust too much. And when we look at what worries people about a particular party being elected or re-elected, it's clear that this election will be lost on distrust rather than won on trust. So we ask people, what if anything would worry them if the LNP were re-elected at the next federal election? And they tell us things like Scott Morrison, Peter Dutton and other right-wing liars. They tell too many lies, won't take responsibility for their own words and actions. I used to vote for them. Never while these horrible people are in the party. And many other things. The last line I thought was interesting. It would mean Australians are okay with corruption and incompetence. And what, if anything, would worry people if the Labor Party were elected at the next federal election? Well, people feel equally strongly about this. Oh God, heaven help us, they say. We'd go broke as a country within one term. Union mates would be in top jobs. We'd have China all over us in terms of investment, including selling our country to them. we'd go backwards 20 years. Scotty's a genius compared to anyone in Labor, and that's saying something. So people feel very, very strongly. We don't ever find this level of emotion when we ask people why they vote for the party they're going to vote for, or why they say that, or what they like about the party. We get quite soft responses to those things. This is where the real emotion is. It's really, really strong. So distrust is not just the absence of trust, it's a really different beast. Doubt, suspicion, anxiety, fear, self-protection. Recognise any of this? It could be a map for the Australian psyche, if you ask me. Again, this is the context in which we enter a federal election campaign. So before we look at individual politicians, and that's really fascinating, we're first going to look at what Australians think about government, or government more broadly, including things like the ABS, the ACCC, Centrelink, Comcare, the Education Department, the whole range of government and services. Now, I know this slide looks really complicated. You can get a copy of the slide later to ponder over it, but bear with me and let's just focus on the graphic. So green is for trust. Those green bars show how much the government and government instrumentalities are trusted. Red is for distrust. And that black wobbly line with the dots is essentially the net score. It's trust minus distrust. So that's the story. If you just follow that wobbly line, what the graphic shows is that since May of 2019, we've actually had some ups and downs. The government's trust and distrust have gone up and down, and they've basically, whenever there's been a crisis, had an opportunity to improve. Even once we got over the initial really bad dip after COVID and things like JobKeeper and all of the government support kicked in, there was an improvement. And then we had Brittany Higgins, the sexual assault allegations, etc. And we saw trust starting to trend down, distrust growing. And essentially, it's ended in a really negative place. If we now look at a longer view, and go back to 2007, even before Roy Morgan began continuously measuring trust and distrust, we were monitoring two key statements. One, I don't trust the Australian government. And the second one, the government's doing a good job. So I don't trust the Australian government is the red line, it's very much distrust. And the green line is the one that says the government's doing a good job. And if we look at the red line, we see basically during Labor disunity of the Rudd-Gillard period, distrust in the Australian government soared. The red line went charging up. Simultaneously, belief that the government was doing a good job tanked. And that pattern remained pretty consistent throughout the Abbott, Turnbull, and even the early Morrison governments. Then in 2019, when Scott Morrison won the unwinnable election, things changed. More people thought the government was doing a good job. We can actually see the green line starting to pick up, and fewer people distrusted the government. But by June 21, you can see it's back to a bad situation again. It all went into reverse. Black summer bushfires, parliamentary sex scandal, the COVID, vax, the PCR delays sent trust plummeting and distrust rising. And we see here that we're in a situation where we have more distrust than we have confidence in the government. So how does that bigger picture play out when it comes to individual politicians or individual players? You'll be unsurprised to hear Roy Morgan's done a survey. In early March, Roy Morgan conducted a snap SMS survey, about 1,400 people were surveyed, and asked about Australia's most trusted and distrusted politicians. Actually in Parliament are the ones who are interested. And the answers might surprise you. They might not. It surprised me. At the time of the survey, Penny Wong had retained the highest net trust score. So the chart on the right is March 2022. The one on the left is what the numbers were like 2 years earlier, March 2020. And we're able to make that comparison. So Penny Wong is at the top. Anthony Albanese jumped 5 places from 2 years ago to second, and Tanya Plibersek moved into third. So the ALP leaders dominate the net trust score table. Now the leader, if we look purely at trust, and remember we have trust, we have distrust and net trust score. If we look just at trust, we see Anthony Albanese is the most trusted of all, followed by Penny Wong and then Western Australian Premier Mark McGowan. Greens leader Adam Bandt has slightly more trust than Jackie Lambie. Interestingly, and it is really interesting when we see Gladys Berejiklian, although she's not a sitting member, and despite the fact that she resigned because of an ICAC investigation, she is still there in the trust stakes. So she must have had an extraordinary amount of trust before all of those things happened. But even trusted leaders can have relatively high levels of distrust. And we see Albanese definitely more trusted than distrusted with the green and the red, but significant levels of distrust and more distrust than Penny Wong. That's why when we look at the net trust, Penny Wong comes out on top. So why do we trust Penny Wong? Why do people trust Penny Wong? Well, basically, the reasons people give are things to do with her being genuine, honest, ethical, a conviction politician, if you like. And why do we trust Anthony Albanese? Essentially, he's honest, compassionate, and ethical and genuine. So these are the things that people say about him. And of course, there's a little bit of distrust even for these trusted leaders. We now look at Australia's most distrusted political leaders, the other side of the coin. And we see Scott Morrison, of all the sitting politicians, Scott Morrison has the highest net distrust score. Coalition politicians dominate this distrust area, as do men. And not in Parliament, Clive Palmer has the highest net distrust score. But Morrison is in fact more distrusted than Clive Palmer, as we'll see in a moment. Compared to 2 years ago, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg is the really big improver. And this is quite important if the coalition loses and there's a leadership battle between Frydenberg and Dutton. And just like trusted leaders can have levels of distrust, even distrusted leaders can have some level of trust. So we see that there's not much trust really in general, but Scott Morrison is the most trusted if we just look at trust, although his trust score alone is less than that of Anthony Albanese. And Josh Frydenberg is the second most trusted, more trusted than Dutton. But when we add in distrust, we see Scott Morrison's punishing level of distrust. Peter Dutton is much more distrusted than Treasurer Frydenberg, crucial obviously in any competition between the two. And we've left in the chart Clive Palmer, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, even though we don't rank them. So why do people distrust Clive Palmer? Spreading lies, unproven claims and self-interest. I think the idea that his money allows him to do or say anything he wants to do is a really telling point. But also, why do people trust Clive Palmer? This is really interesting. He's more likely to present alternative positions to mainstream, which challenges me to think more deeply about issues. This is the world that we live in at the moment. And why do people distrust Scott Morrison? Well, there's a litany of reasons. He spreads disinformation, he doesn't take responsibility, absent in a crisis, dishonest, deceitful, and just doesn't take responsibility for his failures. On the other hand, those that trust Scott Morrison say he cares, say he's not trying to pull others down, he's calm and consistent and trying to do his best. Is that enough? Finally, we invited some questions from the audience, and here's a great one that came from a regular webinar viewer. I'm not sure whether we can use her name, so she's just Catherine from Bunnings. And she says, when distrust in government and the institutions created to represent the people declines, who are people turning to lead them? Thanks, Catherine. That made us think, made us go back through the data, and I have to say there's no obvious replacement. Whenever there's a bit of a crisis, church attendance goes up, and indeed we're seeing that. So people visiting their place of worship has gone up a little bit. But on balance, our view really is that what's happened is that there is nowhere for people to turn, that people are feeling a bit lost and a bit rudderless. So we aren't turning to leaders at all. Our leadership would equal confidence, and our consumer confidence, our confidence is at a really low ebb. Confidence tells us that our future's under control. We're not feeling that, and that we're feeling comfortable about things. We're definitely not feeling that. So without leadership, and the distrust we see in leaderships does seem to have made a big gap, we're kind of all at sea and a bit lost. And I think the data on mental health, anxiety, fear, people actually being afraid, and the sense that the world's a dangerous place lets us know that there is in fact a big gap. So let us know in the comments, in your comments in the webinar, what you think. Do you actually think that we're right? Do you think people are turning elsewhere, or is there a real gap? Thank you, Catherine. So now for the quarterly update. And just before we look at the quarterly update, normally what we would do is we'd look at this last quarter, or the year to December 21 compared to the previous quarter. But this time there's been so many changes during COVID since December 2019 that we've decided to look at this period and focus our attention on that. So much has happened since 2019. Bushfires, floods, cyclones, COVID. Supermarkets have replaced general retail as the most trusted sector, the COVID effect. The banking sector, as a sector, has dropped 14 rankings to become the second most distrusted sector in the economy. Insurance has had its own issues with natural disasters, and particularly payout claims and criticism about that. They fell 13 places from fourth place to 17th. And media dropped 7 rankings. Just let's have a look at this. First of all, the bank industry. A closer look at that, having been savaged by the Royal Commission and various scandals, since COVID, banks are more distrusted than they're trusted. But what's really interesting in this sector, and somebody actually asked this question, individual banks have improved, and particularly the big 4. The problem lies in the category, with more people saying they distrust all banks. So when we say which company or brand you distrust, they say banks. All banks are distrusted. So it's a very, very industry or category sector distrust. But individual banks are starting to make really good headway. And if we look at the insurance industry with COVID and the natural disasters like storms and floods and bushfires, Australians became more and more critical of the major general insurers and their performance dealing with these claims. So this is the opposite to the banking industry. This isn't kind of my insurance company or specific insurance companies are fabulous. It's the industry as a whole. It was the major insurance companies that were named, and particularly in relation to their settling claims, which is obviously a time when trust is tested and distrust is likely to flare. The media sector has also become less trusted and more distrusted. The drop in trust, and you can see there the green has actually dropped away, is largely due to increasing perceptions of bias, a reduction in the quality of what they're producing, and a lack of independence. The increase in distrust, when we ask why people distrust, is more due to privacy issues, fake news, and a lack of integrity. They're different words. They're more vitriolic. And the dramatic decline in the media sector's net trust has been contributed quite strongly by a decreasing trust in Fairfax, now 9, and the ABC. There appears to be a correlation between the ABC's trust decline and a series of legal and political scandals surrounding the national broadcaster. That said, this is a very green chart. That said, the ABC is still the most trusted media brand. So it's time now to look at the most trusted and most distrusted brands in Australia. And as I said, normally we'd look at this quarter on quarter. We're now looking at it 2 years ago and now. If anyone is eager to know what's happened in the last quarter, write to us and we'll let you know. We will send you the information. So let's look at net trust first, those brands that have more trust than distrust. How have brands changed? Well, Bunnings and Aldi have fallen to 3rd and 4th positions in the last 2 years, replaced by Woolworths and Coles at the top. RACV and PayPal have dropped out of the top 20 to be 28th and 29th. And as we just saw, the ABC, the 6th most trusted brand in 2019, has since fallen to 17th position. So now let's look at Australia's most distrusted brands, those where distrust outweighs trust. Facebook and Telstra remain the 2 most distrusted brands. And compared to rankings of the most distrusted brands 2 years ago in 2019, Harvey Norman and Uber are the big losers. Both trusted brands in 2019, they're now in the top 20 most distrusted brands. Harvey Norman is a standout loser, soaring from 46th most trusted brand 2 years ago to be the 7th most distrusted by December 2021. Adani All Bravas and NAB recorded the largest improvement, becoming less distrusted. Perhaps the Adani name change is finally having a positive effect. And NAB improved 25 places, falling from 4th most distrusted to 29th. Now, when we talk to our clients, we're often asked, how do you rebuild trust? We tell our clients you can't begin to rebuild trust until you've neutralised distrust. In corporate Australia, the big banks did this by changing their leaders. Adani changed its name, as did Facebook. And sometimes simply the passage of time neutralises the pain of distrust. Of course, in politics, there's always someone there to remind you. There's always somebody saying, oh, remember they did this. So you can't in politics just hope that it will all go away. Sometimes an external event provides a window of opportunity, a distraction. We've even developed language for this. We talk about changing the narrative. And we've all heard, never waste a good crisis. Strategic inflection point was coined by Andy Groves. And these are the things that essentially they're right. We can't worry about everything at once. So something that takes the pressure off what we're annoyed about or worried about does create this window of opportunity. So we saw supermarkets gaining trust throughout COVID. So prior to COVID, supermarkets were talked of in terms of whether they were paying their staff correctly, the prices that they were charging, the language was price gouging. All of those relatively negative things were the things we were hearing about supermarkets. And then throughout COVID, they stepped in where they were needed, where they were really needed. They kept stores open. They improved the online experience. They managed all of the crazy shortages and all of the way that they kept everybody safe in their stores. They were there when we needed them most. COVID also gave the big 4 banks an opportunity to step up and do the right thing, and they did. Reducing interest rates, when the banks came out of the Royal Commission, essentially everyone was really angry. And there's nothing much they could have done. They shouldn't have gone out and sponsored little kids playing football or something like that. It would probably have been viewed incredibly cynically. But in fact, what COVID did was gave them an opportunity to do exactly what we needed them to do. They reduced interest rates. They gave people mortgage holidays. They helped in the ways that it was most important and it was most valued and most appreciated. And as a nation, we rewarded them with greater trust and much less distrust. This isn't spin. This is the opposite of spin. This that the supermarkets and the banks did was real. The challenge, of course, now will be for these organisations to manage the next phase. The real cost of COVID to the supermarkets. We'll see increased costs. Banks will have to deal with increasing interest rates. So that is the next phase. They'll still have to see if they can retain the levels of trust they have and not go into a distrust stage with the people. Now, when we think about politics, and we think about the election, and we think about what would be the kind of interventions or what would be the external events. Well, we've had a few, haven't we? We've had the global pandemic, the war, and even the allegations of bullying in the top ranks of the ALP. each of these create a kind of opportunity to move the dial on distrust, paving the way for trust. Now, politically, events like a war or a global pandemic would normally and historically have seen a substantial swing to the government in power, the government of the day. That's not what we've seen in this instance. It hasn't resulted in that kind of shift, and the electorate remains in a state of net distrust with the government. Again, this is the context that we enter the federal election campaign today, still ensconced in COVID restrictions, fears, global unrest, and petrol prices over $2 and expectations of inflation to come. So that's where we are today. Now, this has been an extraordinary experience, looking at all of this data, hearing what people have to say in their own words, analysing it, understanding it. It's been really extraordinary. I've loved every minute of the analysis, and I hope you found it valuable. Now, just before I go, a quick ad break. If you'd like more detail on these brands, either brands that you own or brands you love or brands you'd like to have a look at, buy the full 2022 report from our online store. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you all.